Let's see. I guess I'll go ahead and
Yeah, share your screen.
put that first there. Hopefully everybody can see that okay.
Yeah.
And I want to make a little disclaimer first because not all the pictures here were taken by me. Most of my pictures are slides that have never been scanned, and I don't have an electronic means to display transparencies on my computer. So a lot of these slides came from other people and they deserve credit. I'm not going to list everybody, but if anybody wants to know who took what, you can always ask me. All right. So a lot of you probably haven't got a clue what Phemeranthus is, or if you do, you probably knew it at one time as Talinum. Um, there's been a lot of confusion over the years about uh, Talinum versus Phemeranthus. It even boils down to a confusion in their most common name. Um, Phemeranthus have long been known under a couple of fairly widely known common names, vernacular names. One is fame flower, and that refers to their tendency to have flowers that open at a particular time every day. At least that's the theory. It might also be related to the saying that fame is fleeting. And these plants have, most of the species have a tendency to live underground most of the year and just make a brief appearance when conditions are right, pop up, show themselves, bloom like crazy, and then they disappear again. Um, the common name's even been corrupted to flame flower with an L because the Talinums often have bright orange or yellow or red flowers. So, but they're very different plants, and I'll get into that more later. Um, so, a little bit about just what a Talinum is. Well, my computer's lagging here. Let's uh, talk a little bit about where they belong, what they're related to. Phemeranthus were traditionally placed by most in the genus Talinum, which I've already mentioned, and they were placed in the family Portulacaceae. But in recent decades, particularly in the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of molecular work done and a lot more work done on other characteristics of the plants. And it's been figured out that Portulacaceae is kind of a big sprawling lump of similar looking plants, but they aren't all as closely related as thought. And if Portulacaceae was recognized in the wide sense that it used to be known, based on DNA, we have to roll in a few other things like cactus. And that doesn't go over too well with cactus people, and most people just don't really want to lump them together. And since the Cactaceae and the Portulacaceae were described by the same author at the same time in the same publication, either name could take priority. So if you lumped them together, either all the Cactaceae would become Portulacaceae, or all the Portulacaceae would become Cactaceae. So what has happened alternatively is rather than have one big family, they've divided it up into several smaller families. So this is I've highlighted a couple of parts here because here's Talinum, which they now put in the Talinaceae. And here's Phemeranthus, which is now in the Montiaceae. And the Portulacaceae, the only genus left is Portulaca. Everything else is in some other family now. Didieriaceae, Cactaceae, Anacampsorotaceae, Hylotaceae, Basilaceae. So there's several small families, and Montiaceae and Cactaceae end up being the two biggest with the most genera. I wasn't even going to try to list all the cactus genera here. It's not really relevant anyway. So just to make the point a little more, this is from where my cursor is here, if you can all see that down, is what used to be Portulacaceae. Now it's here's highlighting some of what's all been divided up. So here we have Phemeranthus and the Montiaceae, and I crossed out Portulacaceae because they don't put it in Portulacaceae anymore. And here's another group that includes the Cactaceae and most of the other former Portulacaceae, and it's not even, they're separate groupings. The Didieriaceae and the Basilaceae actually come out. Didieria, and you probably all know, comes out closer to Phemeranthus than Talinum. But I don't want to dwell on that. Here's another similar graphic showing the families and most of the families. So moving on, where are the Montiaceae found? The Portulacaceae in the broad sense pretty much covers the entire planet except where it's too cold, the Arctic and the subarctic. Well, the Montiaceae is a little less wide ranging. It's restricted primarily to, well, basically, it's in most of the world except for Africa. And why it's not in Africa, who knows? And it's more extensive in Eurasia than this map shows. So what are a few other Montiaceae? Just a few examples here that we might know. Cystanthe used to be put in Calandrinia, but they've split it. So here's grandiflora. It's a common garden plant, a white form of it, taken wild in Chile. Claytonias. One thing you'll notice, most of these other genera and most of the species have flattened leaves. Phemeranthus has cylindrical leaves. Most of them show a midrib. For Phemeranthus, you can't see the midrib. And most of these, when the buds are forming, the flower buds and the fruits, most of them, the buds and the fruits hang down while the flowers turn up while they're open. In Phemeranthus, they tend to point up all the time. The fruits don't hang down. Sometimes they might point a little bit to the side. Here's Lewisias also. This is Lewisia pygmae, which is in some condition, it's easy to confuse with Phemeranthus, but Lewisias, all but one have at least somewhat flattened leaves, just with an edge. So Phemeranthus itself is American. It's not native to anywhere but North America and South America. And there's only one species in South America. Sorry, these maps are a little fuzzy. I screenshot them off of iNaturalist. That was the easiest place to compose them. Anyway, there's one species, Phemeranthus pune, in the Andes. It's closely related to species in Mexico. Otherwise, they're strictly North American. They're pretty widespread in North America, but they do not occur anywhere along the West Coast. They're not in subtropical humid climates. And most of these gaps in the map are just artifacts of either agriculture or lack of sampling. But this gap up here across the Rockies from Nevada to Montana, that's real. And this gap in the Mississippi Basin is real. And I don't know why they're not up here. It seems like they ought to be. The Mississippi Basin is probably just not good habitat. So, well, I'm jumping too far ahead there. A few traits I'll point out as we go along, but I'll mention them now of about what makes a Phemeranthus as opposed to other members of the Montiaceae family. The seeds have a membranous aril coating. It's an outgrowth of that covers the seeds as they develop. It comes from the fenunculus, which is basically the umbilical cord. The pellicle is kind of it's almost see-through, but sometimes it makes the seeds look gray, and it's easy to peel off the seeds. It's all Phemeranthus have that, and it's the only genus in the family that has that. Um, they have tuberous roots, usually, not always. That's not unique to them. They have cylindrical leaves, which is almost unique. There's only a few Calandrinias and Lewisias that approach that. They have two sepals, like most of the Portulacaceae alliance. They usually have 5 petals, but occasionally they vary up to 8. They have multiple stamens, which isn't unique. They have 3 to 5 stigma lobes on the end of a elongate pistil, and the capsules dry at maturity and they split open. They either look like a basket just staying on the plant dry with the seeds falling out, or they disintegrate and just fall off in pieces. So there's more to it. They're cute. They're real pretty. They're great rock garden plants. But and I'll talk a little bit about other things as we go along. So the genus itself can be divided into 2 subgenera or sections. One is called, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I've always said Utmund, and that's very English pronunciation, I'm sure. The group is characterized by seeds that have concentric raised ridges, um, kind of an interesting pattern. And there's one exception to that trait. They usually have they all have a swollen tuberous taproot. Sometimes it's like this, varying to very round and spherical. And on some species, it can be up to 4 inches. And most of the species are just have on top of that, when they're growing, they just have a little cap of leaves. There's barely any stem developed at all. And then the typical inflorescence, which is a cyme and varies from species to species. Um, these are all species in that group. The other section or subgenus is Phemeranthus. And these species, they're not that different, but most of them only have a little bit of a swollen taproot, if any, or a few have a rhizome that looks a little like an iris rhizome. And they all have, it doesn't show because there's so many leaves, as well as I could have had a better example, but there's a stem with the leaves scattered along the stem. And all of the species in this group have that. And the seeds don't have those concentric raised ridges, all except one exception. There's always got to be an oddball in the group or an exception. So continuing on, I'll start showing pictures of plants now. Um, um, these first, I'm just continuing with the subgenus Phemeranthus. And the first ones, there's a group of species that are kind of compact with fairly thick stems. The leaves are crowded on the stems, and they tend to look, so I start with the flower instead of the stems. My computer's lagging a little. They tend to look a little bit like sedums, and the flower, the inflorescences are short. So the flowers are often hidden, or not hidden, but held down in among or barely beyond the leaves. And this first species that was the range map for the species. It's endemic to central New Mexico. So Albuquerque's up here, and Grants would be off to the west. And they grow on calcareous soil. And it's a cute plant. The flowers are pink. They're a little over an inch. It's a great rock garden plant. um, bluish leaves. My computer's not moving as fast as I'd like it to, but we're good. So, and it's skipping. So when the plants are well developed, they're really quite attractive. And this first group of smaller, lower compact species, they all look kind of similar, but there's differences. So this is Phemeranthus brachypodius. The next is more wide ranging. It's found fairly widely on the Colorado plateaus, and it grows on sandstone, usually reddish sandstone. It's Phemeranthus brevifolius, so which means short leaf, and it's almost identical to the other species, except it's half the size. And the flowers vary from white through pink to purple. Um, and it's equally cute. It's a little bit harder to grow, but not much. And this is pretty common for a lot of species of Phemeranthus where they turn these bright colors when they start to go dormant. And when they decide to go dormant, they go dormant fast. They can be blooming and ripening fruit one day, and 3 or 4 days later, the vegetative parts can be completely gone. And sometimes they're only there for a week or two out of a year, or some years they don't even appear, depending on the species. Other years, the same species might be active for 3 months during the growing season. It all depends on the weather and how much rain and where they grow. So the next one is a recently described one. It is called Phemeranthus rhizomatus. And again, it's very much like the previous species, but it crawls around underground with these long, slender rhizomes. And the flowers average darker, and often the leaves are just a little bit flattened. And it's the only species I know of where this is a common thing, where the leaves can be flattened. It's about the same size as brevifolius, but it grows in a different area. And I didn't mention brevifolius. Yes, I did. Grows on sandstone. This one grows again on calcareous. I think it's a tufa. It's volcanic ash, and it seems to be calcareous, but I've never done a test for pH reaction or chemistry. It just appears to be kind of a fine calcareous dust. And maybe it just looks calcareous, but it's easy to grow. It's another cute little plant, and it's only found in a small area near Reserve north of Silver City, and it leaks over to Arizona just a tiny bit. There's the fruit hiding in between the leaves. So those three species I just showed you, that there's usually only one or sometimes two flowers on a little short inflorescence that's held in the leaves. This species, Brevicollis, is a little more wide ranging from down in, it's mostly in the Chihuahuan Desert and the Southern Rockies, grows on calcareous soils again. Um, it has real pretty sort of magenta purple flowers. But if you can see the inflorescence between the two flowers, there's um, more than one flower. There's a flower bud and a fruit. Well, the inflorescence is indeterminate, and it keeps producing flowers as long as the plant's active. And so this species produces more flowers for longer than the ones I just showed you. So in some ways, it's a showier and better garden plant, even though it's very similar. It also tends to have more pointed petals and more pointed leaves. And I've seen one plant that had white flowers, but normally this is pretty much the flower color. Sometimes it's so small when it first starts blooming, the flowers are bigger than the plant. And that's pretty typical of the ones that I'm showing you now, the little compact ones. So there's a penny, just to give you some idea. Oops, jumped too far ahead. And there. So this is a comparison of three of the species that I just showed you. And it's an old slide. It's not a very good scan, but it gives you the idea. So here is Brachypodius. I think this is a 6-inch pot. And here is Brevifolium on the right. And you see it's much smaller. And in a photograph or when you're out in the field and you're just looking at one species, it's kind of hard to tell these two apart, but they don't grow together in the same place or in the same habitat. And one is way smaller than the other one. Obviously, the bigger one is a little more showy if you're growing it in a garden or in a pot. In nature, yeah, it's a little more showy there too. But this is an example of some of the characteristics that can help separate the plants that aren't obvious sometimes when you read a written description or if you're just looking at one species in one area. The size, the number of stamens. And here on the left is Brevicale, which is the one that has the more flowers per inflorescence. And notice the flowers aren't open. And that's because they open later in the day. So this is rarely recorded in descriptions, but Phemeranthus brevifolius and Brachypodius open their flowers earlier in the day than Brevicalis. And Brevicalis and Brachypodius actually grow together. You can find them growing side by side, and they can be a little bit confusing. But at the time of day when this one, the flowers are closed and this one, they're open, that makes it a lot easier, at least for a few hours. So moving on, the next species is the only species that's known to grow in Canada. And it's kind of like a combination of some of the previous. It got kind of the best of Brevifolius combined with the best of Brevicalis. And it grows in north central Washington and up into British Columbia a fair distance. And it is called Phemeranthus sediformis, which was also named Okanaganensis. But sediformis is the older name. Okanaganensis is a lot more fun to say, though, and it's more of a tongue twister. To be honest, when looking at these slides, it dawned on me there's some other cute stuff here too, and I don't even know what it is. This looks like maybe a Selaginella, and this thing I'm not at all sure. I don't even know if those are leaves or flowers, or it may just be another non-vascular plant. I'm not sure. Anyway, you see here that there's multiple flowers like Brevicalis, but it has the short, compact, more rounded leaves, more like Brevifolius. It also has more rounded fruits and shorter sepals like Brevifolius, which are details I didn't point out for the previous. This one has a tendency to make large clusters that are more perennial. And so it makes more of a statement in the garden because it doesn't disappear quite as completely when it's dormant. And when it comes back in the spring, there's more to it. So you can get more flowers on a single plant. Otherwise, it's not that different. White or pink flowers. And when the foliage is early in the season and compact and tight and hasn't sprawled out yet, and the flowers are opening, I think it's particularly attractive. So next is the last one in this compact group, and it's been confused with Brevicalis a lot. So records from places like New Mexico or Texas are wrong. It's found in Utah and Arizona, and there's a big gap in the middle of its range that it's probably there, but nobody's actually gone and found it, or maybe nobody's even really looked for it. So it's up in central Utah, and then it's in northern Arizona down here. A synonym is Thompsonii, which is what the Utah people prefer because that name was given to the Utah plants. Valigulus is the older name, and that was given to Arizona plants. The plants are identical in both places. There's no difference. And when you grow them together, they're totally fertile with one another. So here's some plants growing in Utah. It gives you an idea of, this is a gravel bed over rock. It gives you an idea what some of the habitats are like. Phemeranthus tend to grow in these rocky flat areas or on rock outcrops. Often they're in rock cracks. Often they're in shallow pans. They may be growing out of moss in the pans. But some species just grow right out in the open. They're out in the grasslands or the sand hills. But overall, most of them tend to be where there's fairly level rock areas. So this is a plant later in the season, and you can see it has fruits, and those will split open and spill the seeds out. This is also in Utah. Another one a little earlier. I got these reversed. The fruits should come last, right? So I'm starting to turn color a little bit at the end of the season. Here's one with a flower that's not fully open. This was actually in Arizona. Here's another one in Arizona with the flower open. So the main feature of this species compared to the ones I just showed is the flower is very small. It's only about it's about a half inch, a little, or right, maybe a hair more, and it has narrow petals, so it's not as showy. And the others all had more stamens. There was kind of a brush of stamens in the center, and this one usually only has about 10 or 15 stamens. And it has slender scapes on the inflorescences, the the stalks. But the flower stalks still go out sideways. They tend to be down in the leaves. And in some ways, this approaches the section Phemeranthus, uh, but it's still one of the compact, small, cute ones. You can see it's not very big. So here's seeds just to give you an idea what they look like size-wise. And a close-up, not a very good close-up, but that's still valigulus. So my computer's hesitating. So this is kind of a side note here. Um, Occasionally, when they grow together, Phemeranthus species can hybridize. It's not often, but hybridization quite likely gave rise to several of the species. Some of the species appear to be polyploid derivatives of two other species. Valigulus is not a polyploid, but it shares a lot in common with Confertiflorus, which will come up soon. Confertiflorus is the plant on the right, and you see the inflorescence is more upright, but the flower is very similar. The two pots in the middle are valigulus, and the flowers, it's done flowering. And the pot on the left is a hybrid between the two. Now, when you're out looking at the plants in the wild and you see valigulus and Confertiflorus growing together, and then there's these other plants, it's pretty obvious they're hybrids. But if you were just looking at them on an herbarium sheet, or if you were trying to describe them, it would be very difficult to characterize just how they're different. But one thing about this hybrid is in these pots, there's 6 plants in each pot. And they're kind of small, compact. There's 2 plants in each of these pots. And these were only 1 year from cutting. So these plants are vigorous and they make bigger clumps of stems, and that means they make more flowers. And so the hybrid is actually kind of cool because it's actually a better garden plant and it's sterile. It doesn't make seeds. That's not always true of hybrids, but it is of this one, which could be a benefit if you wanted to patent the hybrid or something. Um, so moving on to the subgenus Phemeranthus, or the section, the first species that we come to are smaller species with small flowers. And my slides got a little out of order here. So the section Phemeranthus slide is, oh, I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself. There is no such slide. We already saw it. There should have been a slide for these upright species with stems, but that's okay. These are more upright plants with more elongate stems. The inflorescences are long and slender, and they tend to be vertical or at most stick out to the side. The scapes are wiry, slender, and you can see the stems. So Confertiflorus, I'll go back to the map. It's a wide-ranging Western species. It might actually make it to Canada up here. It is in North Dakota, even though the map doesn't show it. And it's much more common down here in Mexico and in West Texas than the records show. It's actually, if you found every plant, this would be solid. There would be no green showing. So it's been confused a lot and misidentified with the species Parviflorus, and it is similar. But in Confertiflorus, you have these narrowly pointed sepals, and the fruits are also more slender and usually a little more pointed. And this dark coloring on the sepals and often on the tips of the leaves is fairly characteristic. Occasionally it's not there or it's weak, but usually it's there. And then the distributions, I've never found the two species together, even though I found them only a few miles apart. There probably are places where they grow together. They may even hybridize. If they do, the hybrids would be hard to recognize, but they should be sterile because the chromosome numbers are different. But anyway, notice that there's only 5 stamens here. That's characteristic for this species and Parviflorus. Occasionally, you'll get a couple more stamens. Also, this species, the flowers are usually white to pink. A purple flower is not common in Confertiflorus. So here's the fruits, and you can see there's a little bit of hint of purple there. Sometimes it's very strong. So here's a plant that was collected for herbarium in Colorado Springs. So this entire plant is about 8 inches tall. It's a quite large one, and here's some little seedlings all around it. They don't tend to live long, most of these species, only a few years at most. The ones that are more branched, like Cediformis and one that's coming up, Spinescens, are more perennial and they live much longer. Or the ones that die down and completely disappear, the underground parts can live for decades. But these ones that have very little of a root system and are mostly stem, usually only a few years at the most. So here's some more of Confertiflorus. It grows in all kinds of habitats, woodlands, stream sides, as long as they're well drained and sunny, sand hills, gravel hills, rock slopes, rock cracks. This is one of the most forgiving species I know, but it does not like limestone. It doesn't like calcareous soils. And you can see again the purple on the fruits. So here's a close-up of an unripe fruit and showing the purple strongly. So next is a lookalike. And this one looks a lot like Parviflorus, but it only grows on calcareous soil. It's usually found on limestone. Sometimes it's on novaculite or other similar, sometimes on gypsum. Um, it looks very much similar. It's about the same size, but the fruits are rounded. And when the fruits mature, they tend to get a little lumpy with the shape of the seeds showing through. And the sepals are almost transparent. There's almost nothing to them. On the stems, this was considered a diagnostic trait when the species was named. It said spines on the stem. Well, it doesn't really have spines. It just has the shredded remains of the bases of the leaves. And those are usually there, but not always. And eventually, if you look at the base of the stem, they disappear. And they also show up on other species. It depends more on the weather and the climate than it does on the species, I think. So it's not diagnostic, but it is usually seen on this species. The plants otherwise look just like Confertiflorus, but for the rock they grow on. And the flowers are a little more spidery looking. They have these ovate petals, kind of narrow. They taper up towards the top usually, and the stamens tend to be. I'm sorry, this picture's not in better focus. This is the best. The stamens radiate outward instead of standing up, and they're usually purple or pink. So here's a close up from the side. And this is an out of focus. This one's actually got a couple of extra stamens, but it gives you an idea, sort of an artsy picture. Here they aren't spread out quite as much, but you can still see it's a little different looking. And here's a plant about the same size. A lot of people have questioned whether it's really different, but it is. Um, Here you can see that the fruit looks pretty different. And occasionally the stamens aren't really very pink, but you can see there's a little bit of pink here. On Phemeranthus confertiflorus, the stamens are usually greenish or almost white. So here's the real standout. This is the only species in the section Phemeranthus that has the raised concentric ridges on the seed. Sorry about the quality of the picture, but it looks almost like some kind of weird AI generated abstract, but it does show what the seeds look like. And this is very unique for this group. So moving on, here's Parviflorus, another wide-ranging species. It's found east of Confertiflorus, mostly in the central lowland part of the country. And it's also extremely forgiving about environment. It grows on a lot of different habitats. They just have to be exposed, fairly dry, and very sunny. Um, it looks pretty similar. The fruits tend to be a little rounder, and they never have that purple highlighting. It has half the number of chromosomes, but that's not very useful in the field. Um, Here's some plants that were collected. I think these were at Joplin, Missouri. So the fruits are usually magenta. Um, Occasionally they're white or pink. And they also usually have those magenta stamens. Uh, here they are growing out of I don't know if this is a Selaginella, but it's very similar to Selaginella. There's basically no soil here. They're just on top of the rocks. So they're very forgiving of habitat. They can grow in sand dunes too, as long as the sand is stable. Typical fruit in a flower bud. And here is a comparison just to give you the idea again of the size of these small flowered ones. On the right is Parviflorus, with the typical little flower that's barely a half inch. And on the left is another species that's coming up, Phemeranthus mengiesii, where the flower's over twice as big. So, and notice there's a lot of stamens here. So just thought that comparison would be of interest. So, and then we move on to some more, even more Eastern. Terita floris is one of those species that it's believed to be derived from two parent species that are diploid, and it's a polyploid. And it has pretty much taken over the available habitats in the Eastern US, particularly east from the Cumberland Plateau and up through the Appalachians. Um, and these are its two parents, supposedly. So what does it look like? Well, this is a painting. I believe this was from like 1818 or something like that. Uh, that was a little stylized. It looks intermediate. It's intermediate in size. It likes the same kind of habitat as both of the parents. Rock slabs, often in moss. It doesn't like it where it's calcareous. Here, the green are the Phemeranthus terita folius, which means cylindrical leaf. So you can see there's a lot of them here. This is a very prolific and vigorous species, and it's very easy to grow in rock gardens. Here you can see the stems very clearly with lots of flower stalks. And there's barely any soil here at all. It's just rock with a little bit of soil on top. It's kind of sandy here. And here's the fruit. It looks pretty much the same as Parvifloris's fruit, but it's bigger. So I'll just jump right into the next one, which is similar. It's a lot like Mengiesii, which will come up soon. This one has a tail behind it. Calicinus was described from the Cimarron River from an expedition. I believe it was one of the railroad surveys in the 1850s. And its type locality is right in here. And I do not know, and I haven't been able to determine from the journals of the expedition whether it was described from Kansas, Oklahoma, or New Mexico. But it is a Western species that grows on the Great Plains on stabilized sand dunes. It's a very large species for Phemeranthus. It can reach a foot tall. The flowers are often an inch and a half or more in diameter. And it's one of the few with fragrant flowers. The flowers, to me, they smell kind of like chocolate. It's a very showy species, but it's very ephemeral. Some years it's only out for a week or so, and then it's gone. So if you don't see it on the day that it happens to be blooming, you don't see it. Some years it might last a month. It depends a lot on the weather. It usually comes out sometime in the summer when it's hot. It can be anytime from June to September. So I've never even figured out when's a good time to find it. I just stumble onto it every now and then. So this is an Asclepias, which gives you a little bit of an idea of size. I don't have a photo of the root, but the root is deep in the ground. Sometimes you can dig 6 inches before you find the root, and it's kind of a slender carrot-like affair that's usually about 2 to 4 inches long and a half inch wide. And then it dies back to that every year and then regrows during the summer after it rains. It's an underappreciated plant, but it'll probably never be a really good garden plant because of its tendency to be there only for a few days out of the year. It has been, well, here's a good photo showing the two sepals that are typical of all Portulacaceae and Montiaceae and most of their relatives. There's exceptions in other genera, but there's no exceptions to the rule in Phemeranthus. So this is the back side of a Phemeranthus calacinus flower. And here's a plant that's actually a few weeks old. It's managed to do pretty well, make several flower stalks. This was a good rainy spell in August. This particular plant was in Colorado near Holyoke. I went there last year and the year before at exactly the same time, and I think I walked for 5 hours. The ground was moist. I could not find a single plant. Phemeranthus convertiflorus was all over the place, but none of these. So one year you luck out, another year you don't. So this is one of my favorites. So moving on, this Rugospermus is another smallish species. It's also quite likely a hybrid. I suspect it's quite likely a hybrid between Parviflorus and Calacinus. It grows in the same kind of sand habitats as Calacinus, but it has an even wider distribution. It's gone further up into the Midwest than Calacinus has. And it looks a lot like Phemeranthus teretofolius, except it tends to have lighter colored flowers and the stigma lobes spread out wide, which most of the species have them short and really held close together. So this one has a huge distribution, but because it was getting confused with Parviflorus, it didn't really get figured out that it ranged all the way from southern Texas to Minnesota until just within the last 20 years or so. And here you can see the chromosome number. The stamen number is intermediate. It's usually around 15 to 20, where Calacinus usually has like 40 or 50 stamens, and Parviflorus usually only has 5 or rarely up to 10. And this little bug, I never bothered to look up the species, but I think it's only about, it's less than a quarter inch long, hardly over an eighth of an inch. So again, the two sepals, and here's a flower bud and the open flower. And on most species, I didn't really elaborate. The flowers open usually only for an hour or two every day, and each species opens at a particular time of day. And it varies a little bit with the season because of the day length and where the sun is. And it varies a little bit with growing conditions, like if they're growing under a tree and getting a little bit of shade, that can affect when they open. But most species, it'll be like you can set your watch by them. It'll be like 5:15 every day for a month, or another species will be 11 in the morning, or there's one species that opens at sunset. So Rugosperma also, it's intermediate in characteristics between the two parents. Now, something I didn't mention about Phemeranthus calacinus is the sepals stay on when the fruits are ripe. And you can see the sepals are here. They're not really that visible on Rugospermus, but on Parviflorus, they fall off before the fruit ripens. So this is a trait of the calacinus parent. And it helps indicate which was the large parent, because most of the larger species, the sepals fall off. So there's a ripe fruit where the sepals have fallen off, but this is just a little later on. The name comes from, the Rugospermus name comes from rough seed, which means, well, Rugo rough, sperma seed. But you can see here that it's a little bit irregular on the surface, so it's kind of a little bit rough, and that's why the name. And it's the only species that has seeds like this. It didn't get this from either parent, but who knows? Maybe it's some genetic weird thing that happened with the parents' genes interacting. or maybe it's just evolution in progress. Who knows? So this one jumped ahead. This is Phemeranthus uh, calcaricus, which occurs on limestone usually, and it occurs in the Ozarks, the Washington. It occurs from central Texas all the way to Tennessee. And its map got out of order because I didn't alphabetize things right. But there's two globs on either side of the Mississippi, over here and over here. And there's more of it. Well, actually, it's more up in here. There's more of it up in Missouri and northern Arkansas, but it's been so badly confused with Calasinus that all these records up here for Calasinus are really Calcaricum. And the two species are quite similar, but Calcaricum grows on limestone and Calasinus does not. Calcaricum grows, oh, and by the way, Calasinus refers to the persistent calyx, the sepals that stay on during the fruit. Calcaricus sounds similar, but it refers to the limestone substrate that the plants grow on. So, but these plants are much more perennial. They're active, can clear through the growing season from April or May until it freezes. And they have instead of a deeply buried vertical rhizome in the sand, they have a taproot, which I'm not sure which it is. On Calasinus, I think it's a taproot, but on Calcaricum, there's a rhizome that's thick, and it's a little bit like a bearded iris rhizome that you see in your gardens. The rhizomes, after a few years, they can crawl laterally through these patches of moss and debris and make patches of clonally reproducing plants. Um, so these plants are long lived in the garden, or at least potentially they are. And this is sort of kind of an example of the rhizome, but it's actually been dislodged, and it's a little messier looking when you actually see the rhizome in the debris. Um, here's a rhizome kind of showing here merging into a stem. So the green part of the stems will die back in the summer, while the rhizome, the perennial part, just lays there. You can find it in the middle of the winter on the soil surface, or barely buried in the ground. So there's a hunk of rhizome there. So it has lots of stamens. Like Calasinum, the sepals stay on, and it is readily available in the garden trade under the wrong name. It's sold under the name Calasinus, but these plants come from the Ozarks. This is growing in a garden in Fort Collins, Colorado. They grow into fairly good sized plants, lots of flowers, and they make these propagules. Parts of the stem are thick, and when the stems dry up, they fall on the ground and they can root and make new plants. Oh, and that name, Ozarkensis, I was going to name it, but somebody else beat me to it. So now it's Calcaricus. So enough of that species. Some ripe fruits. Let's move on to Mangusii, which is a southeastern species. I'm going to have to speed it up here. So this is a wide-ranging species, and it doesn't really have anything new, except that the seeds are shiny black. They don't look gray because the pellicle is tightly oppressed to the seeds. Otherwise, it looks a lot like Calcaricus and Calasinus, but the sepals fall off when the fruits are ripe, and it's more eastern. It does overlap with Calcaricus, but it does not grow on limestone, and it has the spreading, somewhat spreading stigma lobe. So it's possible I'm wrong, and maybe this is the other parent of Rudospermus. And Piedmontanum is a recently described species from Virginia and North Carolina. It's very much like Mangicii. The distinctions are very weak. Um, and but it is different, and I don't remember all the distinctions. It's found east of Mangicii on these rock outcrops east of the Appalachians on the Piedmont, and I'm sure it's much more widespread than just these two parks. Um, but that's where it's been collected so far. And so it's got very showy flowers. And here it is growing with what they're calling now a Puntia misacantha. Give you an idea of the size. Here it is in a pot. And when I'm done, I'll show you that pot. I've got it right here next to me. They're going dormant. So spinescens is the last of this section. And it's very similar, but it is perennial with perennial branching succulent stems. So it makes this permanent clump. And it grows in Oregon and Washington on lava flows. So it's very isolated up there. It's a great rock garden plant, lots of flowers. So moving on to the next section, this will go quicker. We have a bit of an odd situation here where two names I think are getting mixed up, and there may even be a third species involved. Mexicanum is what the Mexicans are calling these, and they are the only species in this section that have stems. And here's a herbarium sheet. This is the type specimen of the name Oligospermus. And you see this cluster of slender stems and little tiny leaves. This was described from San Luis Potosi, and they don't even have any records from up there except these old herbarium sheets. And here's what that plant looks like. It's a little cushion forming plant with yellow flowers and purple flower buds. It's a cute little plant. So the other name is Mexicanum, and these are more elongate stems, and this was described from near Puebla. And these are slender stems and fairly small leaves, and they didn't include the root on the herbarium sheet. This is the type sheet. And here's what they're calling Mexicanum, and it has these short, fat, purple stems, and sometimes it has orange flowers, and sometimes it has yellow flowers. You can kind of see the purple stems right here. And I don't think this is Mexicanum or Oligospermum or Spermus. Sometimes I forget to change the end of the name to match the genus that came from being in Talinum. So it's a pretty plant. I don't know how cold hardy it is because where it grows, it almost never freezes. Here's a smaller plant. This is very unusual for this group, but it has the typical seeds with the raised ridges. And there's a yellow flower on the same. So next we come to another unusual species for the section because it's big. This is the biggest species in Phemeranthus. It's one of my favorites. It can be over a foot tall. This particular one's probably about 10 inches. It's like everything's magnified. The underground roots more elongate and fairly large, and you can see these are centimeters, not millimeters. This is a big plant for a Phemeranthus. It's kind of got this attractive rosette habitat, and it grows on these igneous rock exposures, usually where it's flat. Sorry about my computer lagging. It's got a very attractive form, and it's got pretty flowers that they tend to, at least in some populations, they open when the sun's going down and they're open during the night. And as far as I know, it's the only nocturnal species of Phemeranthus. But I don't know that all the populations are the same on this. This just has dew on it. So the rest of the species all look pretty similar. Here's Palmeri in fruit. These flower stalks are over a foot tall. or over 30 centimeters. Lots of seeds there. And it has those same concentric raised ridges on the seeds. Okay, so now we'll go through these last species fairly quickly because they're all similar. But first though, this is the type specimen of Palmeri. You notice that this is a full-size herbarium sheet, and you notice that the plant minus the root, there's no root here, is almost as big as the herbarium sheet. And you can see over here in centimeters. Um, so anyway, moving on, we now have a little collected, little known species, green manii, and it's typical. Most of these remaining species, sorry about the quality of some of these photos. They're taken from slides and I didn't do a very good job. Um, it's a rosette of leaves and you can't see any stem. And often on this species, the yellow flowers are down in between the leaves. These species all tend to disappear in the winter or when they're dormant. And the entire group, except for that orange flowered one I already showed you, have either white or yellow flowers. Boy, that's really a bad photo, but that's a habitat shot. That's only about as big as my thumbnail. So, and there's a bunch of fruit in there on this one. So the next species, this one is in Arizona and New Mexico, Chihuahua, and it goes down almost to Durango. And it was missing. Nobody knew where it was. It was described and nobody could find it. And then one day I decided, okay, I'm going to find it. And I drove over the Black Range. I got to this spot right here. I walked out. First place I stopped, took me about 5 minutes, and there they were. There were thousands of them. And it was described from right over here. I was on my way to here. So since then, people have been finding it and reporting it and making it official. It's there's a lot of places it grows, and it looks a lot like the last one, but longer inflorescences, more narrow fruits. It's a little bigger plant, football shaped fruit. And then the next one is I can't even read. It's multiflorous, so it is more wide ranging, and it's much smaller in size than the previous two, and it has lots and lots and lots of flowers all crowded on a longer flower inflorescence. And there's often dark coloring in here. And these flowers are only about a centimeter in diameter maximum. And all of this group make good little pot plants. In a rock garden, they tend to be very short-lived and very not present for very long. This is two species, and you can see how similar they are. The one on the right, you see there's a sort of a petiole on the leaf. They're narrowed at the base. That's the only obvious difference between these two species. This is parvulus and this is multiflorous, and both have wide ranges in Mexico. They mostly grow up high in the mountains where there's oak or pine or and on rock slabs. So here's the range of a white flowered version. And again, a wide range, but it doesn't make it to the US. And this one looks about the same, but the flowers are white. And this one is pretty common in cultivation. It's easy to get plants or seeds, at least it used to be. But again, it's a pretty short-lived plant, so you have to keep growing seeds or you lose it. And another wide-ranging species, this one sneaks into the US, and this was that one with the narrow leaf base. And it's very wide-ranging in Mexico, all the way from the Huachuca Mountains up here near Tucson over here. The New Mexico records, I think, are an error. Um, all the way down to Mexico City area and beyond. And this is it in Arizona. You see the little narrow leaf base. These are tiny. These are like small, about the size of a quarter. There's my finger. That's my index finger. Lots of little flowers. And then this one, this is our last species, and this is the only species to be found in Argentina or in South America. Yeah, it's the only one in Argentina too, but it's in southern Bolivia and in Argentina. And on my software on this particular base map, I couldn't draw a very even line. So you got to allow some artistic license here for my little jagged line. But the herbarium records are all from right in here, almost all, and the iNaturalist records are all from right in here. But this is its full range, I think, and I've seen it all through this area. It's a very common plant, and it looks almost exactly like multiflorus. You'd never guess this thing wasn't from Mexico. And here's the seeds. It's the only one in the group that doesn't have the concentric raised ridges on the seeds. So, and these are disintegrated fruits in a little dish. So just real quick, a few slides of some things that get confused with Phemeranthus. This is Portulaca. Notice that the fruits have a cap, and often there's hairs, and they often have similar leaves, but overall they're very different. And now they're in a different family. And the seeds have these amazing ornamentations on Portulaca. It's like jigsaw puzzles. And often they have these pegs that stick out. So, and Portulacaceae is more tropical. It doesn't reach as far into cool climates, so there aren't as many that you can grow in a cold garden. Here's an array of Portulaca species, and a few just for fun. It's showing the diversity of the genus. And the names are on the slides, and I'm going quick because I know we're eating up time here. This one was in my yard. It's a wild one in the Southwest. When you see it coming out of the ground from a tuberous root, it looks a lot like a Phemeranthus, but after it starts blooming, there's no confusing them. This is villosa from South. I forget where this one's from actually. This one's South American. And Talonaceae. Phemeranthus has been so badly confused with Talinum, and I can't figure it out. I have no idea why. Talonaceae are these leafy herby things. This isn't a Talinum, but it looks like one, but I think the flowers on this are cool. This is Amphipetalum paraguayensis, or paraguayense. When I saw this in the wild, I thought it was a Talinum because the flowers weren't there. And I've regretted not bringing a bit home. That was back in the 80s. The flowers are really, really kind of cool. So Talinella from Madagascar or from Eastern Africa. This thing's a shrub, and it has berries. The fruits don't split open like on most of these. These are Talinellas, and these are not very similar to Phemeranthus. Here's a Talinum aurantiacum. Kiger in the Flora of North America put this in Phemeranthus. And look at this. It has a flat leaf with a midrib. It grows a big long stem. It doesn't show on this picture, but it has flower buds that hang down, fruits that hang down. Look at these branching stems, flat leaves. Here's a South African Talinum. Here's another South African Talinum. Nothing to do with Phemeranthus, but these are really neat plants. Here's a South American one. Look here, here's a flower bud hanging straight down. Here's a fruit hanging straight down. On this one, the fruits explode when they're ripe. Here's another Talinum. Here's a Talinum from the Galapagos Islands. Look at that thing. I would love to have that in a pot, but it's a rare plant. Talinum paniculatum. Okay, I've about beaten it to death. This is the closest approach I know to looking like a Phemeranthus in a Talinum. This is not a cylindrical leaf. It's a flat leaf that's rolled over a little bit and it has a midrib. And this one actually, where it doesn't freeze, it has a woody stem. And that's the same species. Okay, Sonore. Here's an unnamed Talinum from Arizona. I like the way it sprawls across the ground. This is African Tenuissimum. The fruit's hanging down, and there it just disintegrated. Look at those big round seeds. These are Talinum seeds. They're variable. They look a lot like Phemeranthus seeds, but they're much bigger. They're black. There's no pellicle except this little aril that's trying to grow around. And sometimes they have a bit of an aril for the ants to grab. But these seeds are much bigger usually, and they look quite different. All right, so